in southern Indiana. I just want to welcome all of you to this special treat of an evening. We wanted to switch it out to have a bit more of an intimate setting for our current speaker. So tonight, we are actually kicking off a new series. Let me tell you a little bit about it. This is the World in Transition Speaker Series. So if you've been seeing these postcards around, please take one home, pass it around to your friends so you can be informed about it. And before we really begin, let's start off with some housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones so they don't disturb the speech. Be good. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce tonight's, we'll talk about the World in Transition Speaker Series first, and then introduce our speakers. Joanne will come up afterwards and also highlight a few other opportunities to sign up as members, and also highlight a few other programs that we have coming down just in actually a few weeks. So, and she'll give you more details in a minute. So the World in Transition Speaker Series was put together to aim to impact the disruptions that were created partly by the Russia's war in Ukraine, and also the stability around the world that we've come to take for granted. So the recent events really have made it undeniable that our economies, our politics, and the climate are inextricably linked. In a digital age, we're staying up to date and involved in international issues is more challenging than ever. The World Affairs Council speaker series is supposed to be a space for fostering learning, connection, and the exchange of ideas in our community. And this is a three-part series, and we'll focus on some of the biggest issues impacting individuals, governments, organizations, and businesses today. And namely, the global economy, the shifting tides in geopolitical power, the effects of climate change. Pretty small topics, right? So WAC will host experts for each of these topics, providing an opportunity for our local stakeholders to hear from the policymakers and professionals closest to these issues. So tonight is the kickoff event, and we'll be discussing Britain and the EU after Queen Elizabeth II. So our guest tonight is Ambassador Matthew Barzun, and he describes himself as always being fascinated with how he can stand out and fit in at the same time, and I hope he can do that too. He's helped countries do both when he served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Kingdom and to Sweden. He helped citizens do both as the National Finance Chair for Barack Obama by pioneering new ways for people to have a stronger voice in our politics. And he also helped tech consumers do both as an entrepreneur when he helped start CNET Networks in the early 1990s. Most recently, Ambassador Barzun is the author of The Power of Giving Away Power, How the Best Leaders Learn to Let Go. That was published in 2021. Ambassador Barzun was raised on the East Coast, started his career on the West Coast, and then settled here in the middle in Louisville. He's here with his wife, Brooke. Well, Brooke's not here tonight, correct?
Correct.
Okay, shoot, I was going to have her stand up. He's married to Brooke, and they have 3 children. And our moderator, after Ambassador Barzun will give a few comments, and then our moderator will come over, and then we'll have a discussion and some Q&A. So Mr. Omar Ayash is moderating tonight's discussion. He's the president of the World Trade Center in Kentucky. He has worked at the local level, national, and international levels as well. Omar is the former director of the Mayor's Office for International Affairs for local metro government under Mayor Jerry Abramson. And most recently, he oversaw many of the innovations and entrepreneurship initiatives at a United Arab Emirates-based educational institution. Omar was born in Amman, Jordan, raised in Vienna, Austria. He is also fluent in Arabic and proficient in German, and thankfully in English. Will you please welcome our guest tonight?
Not a door prize. Hi, everybody. Not a door. This is very new for me. I haven't done many in-person things since COVID ended. One of the things I did during COVID was resolve to never wear a necktie again. But I have to wear glasses now. So I thought that was kind of a trade-off. But when Brooke and I, can I walk out from behind this? Maybe?
There's a microphone over there.
It's not on? We don't need it. All right.
There's one over there.
I don't think you need, do you need it? Oh, no, because they're getting it through here. It's nice to be with people, especially you all. So I didn't bring a necktie when I recently went over to London, but growing up, Brooke's mom and dad, and you know Christy and Owsley, I'm sure many of you, they would always tell her that she had to pack a skirt and her brother Owsley had to pack a tie because you never know when you might meet the Queen of England. So strangely, I did bring a tie just in case on the trip to England, and then Her Majesty passed away the day after we arrived. And so I wanted, just before getting into it with Omar and all of you for what I hope will be a free-ranging discussion, I just wanted to share one lesson that I learned from Her Majesty, and then something to do with the Jack Daniels bottle that I learned from my beloved late father-in-law, Owsley. Sound good? All right, so I get over there to serve as America's ambassador, and one of the first formal things you do is you present your credentials to the Queen. And I went with Brooke, but a few days before, they brief you and you go to a different palace, and you were told. And I met Sir Charles, and we sit down with Sir Charles, and he runs through the whole thing with us. And so we're seated there, and he tells you where you put your top hat, which was great news, because anyone who's ever, I don't think anyone looks particularly good in a top hat. I certainly didn't look good in a top hat. So it was a relief to learn that I could put it away before I met the Queen. And then he said, oh, and by the way, we like to tell all Republicans. And then my wife and I, who happen to be Democrats, sort of sat up and looked strangely. He's like, oh, I don't mean those kind of Republicans. I mean you people from republics. And I was like, oh, that's so, like, I don't think of myself as like from a republic. I mean, I know we are one, but it doesn't, so I was like, oh, okay. And he said, you remember when I told you that you need to bow? And I had remembered, it was about 20 seconds before this. And he said, I don't mean like a subservient bow. If you don't want to, you can just do. I got it, I'm fine. Any questions, any other questions that I have for Sir Charles? And I said, yeah, one. How will I know when it's over? And he said, yeah, they always ask that. And he said, here's my advice. It will be incredibly clear when it's over, but I want you to do me a favor. I want you never to think about it. This is your one shot at doing this. She does this all the time. It's your one shot. Don't blow it by being in your head thinking about, oh, maybe she's sick of me talking now and we could just go out. Just enjoy it. She's really good at it. Be yourself. And then you'll know. So we arrive by horse-drawn carriage, which is strange, with the top hat. And I remember we go into Buckingham Palace, and there are always thousands of tourists. And so there are thousands of tourists there, and they're snapping away. And there's this American voice that the husband says, are they royal? And the smart wife says, absolutely not. And then we go in, and I put down my top hat, and we go in, and we have this lovely conversation with the Queen. The only weird part about it pre-COVID was you stand incredibly awkwardly far apart by tradition. I mean, with America, you sort of want to be like 3 feet, but you're like COVID 6 feet away from her when you're talking. But other than that, it's kind of normal. And so she said this thing, which is the point of my story. And one of the big rules that I was not told by Sir Charles is you are never, ever, ever, ever supposed to say to anyone what you talked about with the Queen in private. But I messed up because she told me something that day that made a real impression on me, and I repeated it, and there was a reporter right there, and so it ended up in the newspaper. So I had to call and apologize, and they were very gracious, the palace was, in accepting the apology. And then what's worse, the thing that showed up in the paper has been repeated like 10,000 times. Every time one of these tabloids writes a story about Prince Harry and Meghan. So I'll tell you the misquote that is out there. I'm going to set the record straight with all of you. The misquote is, Ambassador Matthew Barzun revealed, for parentheses, which he shouldn't have, that the Queen told him that she doesn't allow selfies in her family or at Buckingham Palace. No. And that the implication was that Meghan Markle loves selfies and that this was like a source. So that's not at all what she said. So I want to tell you what she did say to me that day. And then, okay, so we're sitting there, we're talking 6 feet apart. She's well briefed. She's asking me about my time working in the technology industry, and we're chit-chatting. And then I asked her, and I said, ma'am, and you're allowed, you can call her ma'am, after, and I said, what is it like for you going through every day, all those thousands of people clicking pictures at you? I did it once. I'll only ever do it once, and it was pretty strange. And she said, well, they've always taken pictures. They always had cameras. But she said in the early days, they would just hang around their neck, and they'd pick them up, and they would take a picture of it, and they'd put them down. But now, she said, and she had these long white gloves on, and she said, and now they put up these rectangles, and they never take them down. And I miss seeing their eyes. I miss seeing their eyes. And I thought that was just about the sweetest thing I had ever heard. Because in this strange time we're all living through, where in a technical sense we've never been more connectable, and yet we've never felt so disconnected from one another, that it was this sort of lament I felt for this act that if you don't even have to be cynical to think that it's a one-way thing. The tourist snapping the picture and she's being snapped. But she felt and missed this connection. And she recognized it was this mutuality that was happening. So that's why I repeated it to the reporter. It ends up as she doesn't like selfies, which I kind of think is like the opposite point she was trying to convey. Right. So I wanted to say that. And so she dies the day after we get there. And so it was interesting to be with British friends and British strangers as they were all processing her passing. And one of the words, and I'm sure, have you read obituaries or tributes to her okay. I mean, they've been everywhere, right? So one of the words that occurs most, and I think for good reason we would all agree, is steadfast. And I think she was, and I think there's a reason we use that word. And she was steadfast, but I think not in a way, and I think the lesson we all should take, one of the many lessons I take from her life and the way she led, as someone who, by the way, was raised like in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is about 3 miles from Lexington Green and the Old North Bridge in Concord. So like anti-hereditary monarchy is in my DNA. Every April we'd recreate the Revolutionary War in my little town. So I don't have a fondness for monarchy in the abstract, but in this remarkable woman, I think she has lots to teach us, which brings me to the bottle of Jack Daniels, which my late father-in-law, who is also my godfather, because I got baptized at age 36, and if you get baptized as a grown-up, you get to pick your own your own godparents, which is pretty cool. So I picked him as my godfather, and he told me once, and I'm sure he told other people, he's like, there's something really wonderful going on with this Jack Daniels bottle, because if you ask consumers what they like about it, they say, I love it, it never changes. He said, and here's the secret, it always changes. And here's how he did it. He said, this is the bottle of Jack Daniels. This is the public. If it never changed, we're all changing, we're being born, we're dying, we're changing our minds all the time. It would be impossibly old-fashioned if we never changed. On the other hand, so if it stayed fixed, it would be totally changing in the eyes of the public. If it got far out front, that's sort of obvious, it would be discombobulating so he said the challenge is to constantly be changing with the people, and that's how you never change. And I think Her Majesty had a similar insight that over her 70 years reign, she was in a rolling and constant renegotiation of what it meant to be a monarch in those changing times. She understood the empire was over. She didn't try to recreate it. She didn't get fixated in the past, nor did she go far out front. A couple times she lagged behind, and she had the wisdom to catch up. And people who loved her had the courage to say so. And I think there's a beautiful mutuality in my father-in-law's remarks about change. Change isn't something that happens with you or with me. It happens between us. And that's what I've been reflecting on since coming back from London. And I would love to dive into it with Omar and with each of you now that we can all be in the same room together. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you. Ambassador Barzun, it's good.
You have to call me Matthew.
Matthew.
That's the deal. No tie, no title.
Good to see you again.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Too long.
Yes. How you doing?
Oh, fine. Yeah. I mean, I can't give you the real answer. No, okay. I met this amazing woman. Have you heard of Taylor Swift? Okay, I met Taylor Swift's mother, who is an unbelievable woman. And I was sitting with her in London. Taylor Swift's talking to our kids. They're huge Taylor Swift fans. She's so, I'm the best dad ever for introducing them to Taylor Swift. I'm just happy. And I say to Mrs. Swift, who I just met, your daughter Taylor is amazing. And she said, thank you. You know, her brother Tim's great too. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know she had a brother. And then she tells me about Tim, and Tim has some struggles. And then I share a struggle that my wife and I are having with one of our sons. And I said something I bet all of us here have said about someone we love. I said, I just want him to be happy. You know, kind of a throwaway line. And she grabs me, and we, like this. And she goes, no, you don't. And I sort of thought, oh, dear. And I was, okay. And she said, I used to say that, but a smart woman told me that that's not really what we mean. And she said, look at Taylor. She's not always happy. She's like, you're not always happy. That's certainly true. She's like, I'm not always happy. What I think we mean, said this friend of hers, is that we want our children to manage their happiness and unhappiness well. And I said, yeah. And she said, I've vowed to always pass that on to everyone I meet. So there you go. So I'm continuing Andrea Swift's passing it on. So in honest answer to your question, I am managing happiness and unhappiness okay.
Very nice. I think we'll all manage happiness and unhappiness well. So let me start out by, taking us through the journey. Thanks for sharing the story about how, meeting the Queen and what have you. But really, what was it like being ambassador of Sweden and then the UK? And how do you reflect on it from that perspective, given to where the world stands today?
So I did Sweden first and then London. I loved them both. I never went to graduate school. So what I'm about to say is more from people like my wife who have gone to graduate school. Going to Sweden felt sort of like college, like it's new, you're looking around everywhere, you're open to all the possibilities. And then at graduate school, which would be London in this case, it's like you also have buildings, there are quads, there are teachers, but you just sort of kind of go through it with more linearity and more purpose and less looking around. So people ask much more questions about London because we're more familiar with London, but I probably learned more in Sweden.
And what was the day-to-day like activities of being an ambassador in Sweden versus in London?
Well, no one comes to Sweden. Which is actually a blessing. There's this wonderful Republican friend of mine who worked for Colin Powell. My friend Walter was Assistant Secretary of State for Africa in the George W. Bush first term. And he was giving me advice as a first-time diplomat, and he said, everyone on your team is going to try, because they think it's part of the job, to lure President Obama or Vice President Biden or Secretary Clinton or someone to come over and visit, because that's what they think the fun part of the job. He's like, I'll just tell you, it's miserable when they come. I mean, it takes all your team's time, and it's not really the fun part of the job. The fun part of the job is to be America's representative in that country and do that. So don't try to get them to come. I sort of did that. I think they wouldn't have come anyway. But so I really loved representing our country in that country, which at the time the big thing was like that they're not in NATO. So now, lots changed. And I remember getting to Sweden, and this wonderful senior Swede says to me, he didn't say son, but it was sort of implicit in sort of tapping me on the shoulder. All you Americans want to talk about is the global war on terror, and you never want to talk about Russia. We have fought 300 wars with Russia, and you shouldn't take your eyes off them. And I was like, yes, but we're supposed to talk about terrorism. So that's what we did. So, yeah.
London?
Yeah, and then London was, in Sweden, my hunch was, because I had moved to Louisville, which I love, I was like, there are amazing people in these cities that people fly over. And interesting people are spread equally, attention is not. Let's go. And Stockholm's one of those places like London that is the political capital, the cultural capital, the financial capital, the you name it. So it sucks up everyone's attention in this one capital city. And I was like, let's just get out of here. And 100% of our staff is in Stockholm. Let's go to Umeå. Let's go to Luleå, these places that are beautiful and vibrant like Louisville, have lots of interesting stuff going on. We'll set up a little embassy in a box. We'll bring an Airstream trailer. We'll be like tacky Americans and just like embrace it. Like, the good sense of it, just here we are. And it really was fun. And then I got to London, and my little sister married a British guy, and he had heard about the Airstream, and he's like, please, don't. Don't. And so I listened to him. I didn't bring an Airstream trailer to like Newcastle and Liverpool. But I did decide to go to meet with high school seniors, because the good people at Pew, charitable researchy types, thank you, they had done a survey of 40 countries asking all age groups, do you like America a lot, sort of in the middle, not that much. 39 of the 40 countries, young people had, especially due to Obama, young people had a much higher approval rating of America than their parents and grandparents, except for the UK. And that's mainly because the grandparent crowd was so overwhelmingly positive. But by contrast, the young people just sort of middle to slightly down. They don't remember Churchill and FDR. They remember the Second Iraq War. They remember Edward Snowden. They remember lots of stuff that isn't all warm and fuzzy. So I decided I had to do something about that. And I knew they didn't want to hear some lecture on American foreign policy. So I'd go to these schools. At the end, I ended up doing 200 schools, 100 kids at a time. And I brought one of these, a blank A5, they say in England, a blank A5 card, gave it to 100 kids. And I'd say, just draw me a picture of something that frustrates you about America. And they would, and then we'd talk about it. And so I have 20,000 of these cards back on Cherokee Road. 10,000 of them have the exact same doodle. So I gave him an embassy pencil. That was the trade. Just a little sketch of a handgun. And so I was like, who knew, right? They didn't want to talk about Edward Snowden, Israel, Palestine, all the stuff that we're trained on. So here are so I made them into a word cloud. That's misleading. My wonderful team transcribed them into word clouds. Every time we'd have 100 cards, they'd enter it in. So I always kept an updated one in my suit pocket. And I would give it to Secretary John Kerry or to President Obama, all these people who'd visit a lot in London. I'd say, here's the latest from 18-year-olds all around the country. I wouldn't go anywhere and not do one of these school visits. So guns, number 1. Racism, number 2. Police brutality, number 3. That's 2013, 14, 15, 16. Never wavered. Might spike a little bit, but always consistently the top. And then I would color code them. So guns, police brutality, and racism would be in red, along with healthcare would be in red. That was number 4. And then things like Israel, Palestine, surveillance, and things like that would be in blue. And the not so subtle thing for the John Kerrys or other visitors was like, notice that the blue in that model is foreign policy. We're all trained to talk about foreign policy. Domestic policy is foreign policy.
Keep going.
That's it.
That's it?
Yeah.
So how do you work on these issues? I mean, it's very interesting. Being the U.S. representative, and these are the 3 top issues that are constantly being the focus. How do you deal with it? What were some of the things, or when you talk to Secretary Kerry or the president or anyone, how do we as a country move forward beyond that? I know that this is different from.
I don't know. I mean, I sort of what I wrote the book about a little bit, but I was sort of out of step with certainly the culture of the State Department, and I love those folks. And I just, so one of the things I would say, it started in Sweden, and it's not quite fair, and this is a wonderful group, so, but it's like, how many people here, quick show of hands, like to lose an argument? Right? And I'd say it's like nobody, except if you ask it to 118-year-olds, some dude in the back, always a boy, just to be contrarian, raises his hand. But mostly we don't like to lose arguments. And I was like, so why do we spend so much time and effort being really good at winning arguments? I just think it's bad math. And I learned that on the campaign. Because we'd get together these volunteer fundraisers, and I was one of them, and everyone would be like, arm me with the talking points to go back to Boston or Austin or San Francisco so I can win the argument with my progressive friends why they should support Barack Obama and not Hillary Clinton or whatever it was at the time. I was like, what? No. Like, think about the language we're using, arm them, right? And target list. It's like hunting. I mean, it really is. It's gross, it's violent, it's terrible math. And the bad math is the following. We're in Kentucky, I can talk about deer hunting. I mean, if there's sort of 10 deer gathered under a tree and you're up in a blind and you shoot at one of them, you might get one, the other 9 will definitely run away, right? And that's sort of like the fundraising mentality, like call 10 people, 3 will agree to have coffee, 1 might say yes. Sort of that grim math. I chose, borrowing from this great business blogger, Seth Godin, like we should think of it like farming. You're planting seeds, you're asking a little bit. It's just not a hunting mentality. And I think the winning, this culture of winning is really unhelpful to the job of being a diplomat. It's like, but but they're all about that. And the way I tried to not just sound like a weirdo was I would write on one whiteboard in all cap letters, also, ALSO. And I'd say, everyone here, this is foreign service officers. I was like, you didn't get to Sweden or London and to this part of your career unless you aren't really good at arguing, A. I would change it up, lecturing, or I would do leading, depending on how polite I was feeling. S, strategizing, and O, organizing. And they'd all kind of nod their heads. I was like, I can do that too. You guys do that. There's a time for that. And then I'd write on the other whiteboard, also in lowercase letters. And I'd say, look, the stuff I'm doing with the Airstream trailer and the stuff I'm trying to do outside this fortress embassy is this other thing, which is asking other people about their hopes and fears. That's the A. Linking them to our own hopes and fears. That's the L. Serving that overlap and opening up and being honest. And I was like, you should try that too. It's pretty effective. And it doesn't mean you're giving up on this other one. You can also be like that. And that was kind of the mode I tried to be in.
Exciting. So let me just talk about the family a little bit. How did they feel about the experience of, Brooke or the kids, being part of a diplomatic family and experiencing that and then eventually coming back to Louisville?
Mixed, honestly. I mean, the kids were kind of, it's a well, security. So you get these armed, you have a chase car, you drive around in an armored car. There's never an armed person not with you if you're an ambassador. So let's say we take a walk in the park with our little dog named Lincoln, and it's our 3 kids, and Brooke and I, and we're walking, just for the sake of argument, in sort of like the Olmsted Park equivalent, Regent's Park, which is where our house was. And you're out there, and let's just say I went this way, and the rest of the family went this way. All the security people come with me, and no one goes with them. So that does at least two unhelpful things. One is they feel very like othered, like, well, what's so great about him? And then as the husband or dad, you're just like, well, look, like nothing would be more awful than something happening to the people I love most in the world. But the protocol is very strict. It's like we need to protect this person in this role, male or female, and not their partner and not their kids. So that's weird and not unnoticed. But by the end, I think they appreciate the experiences they had, but they all were very excited to come back home.
Very nice. It's good to have you back home.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
You too.
Yeah, I know. So what does it really mean to be posted to the UK? I think that's, there are different posts, and I know in the State Department, some people want to be in certain countries, and sometimes they're posted in different countries, and they're not too excited about that. But what does it really mean to be the ambassador of the United States to the United Kingdom?
Well, the question I would probably get, I loved it. I loved it. I would often get a version of that, which is kind of like the so-called special relationship, which there's a great British guy who right before I left, sort of a new friend, he said, Matthew, do me a favor, we had 2 bits of information. One, don't trust the British press. They will build you up and tear you down. Second bit of advice, don't be one of those people who bangs on about the special relationship. It's hackneyed, it's tired, it's over. Okay. I didn't follow either bit of advice. 2 days later, there was an article in The Guardian that called me a potato with hair. So that was the building up part. So I was like, oh, that's nice. Hadn't even arrived yet, so that was brutal. But then, I actually do think this special relationship, I talked about it constantly. And you'd be, if this was a British audience, if you said the phrase, 100% of the room would be in one of 2 buckets. The eye rollers, like, oh, God, banging on, like my British friend from New York, just like, please not that. But the other group was just like, quick head nod, like, yep. Neither group was thinking, right? Just like instant thumbs up, instant thumbs down to that phrase. My wife is a therapist. So what I tried to do in my time was like unpack it like they do in therapy. And couples therapy in particular. And my wife and I went into couples therapy in London and said so out loud to the British press, which they just thought was like, I can't, do you want to take that back? I was like, I don't want to take that back. Like, my mom's a therapist, my wife's a therapist. I think it's really helpful. Like, I'm not ashamed of being in therapy, it's because to your earlier question, like, it's hard on a marriage to have that, it's hard anyway, but like with that sort of hierarchy enforced and whatever. Right now I'm off track, but yeah. Oh, British press, yeah, special relationship. So let's say we get beyond that, and then they'd say, well, how are the US and the UK going? So I'm like 8 days into the job, front page of the Sun, #1 circulation, no longer, but at the time, #1 circulation newspaper, above the fold. Special relationship dead. It was like a fake death notice. Beloved offspring of FDR and Churchill, leaves behind Thatcher and Reagan. It was funny. And funeral to be held at the French embassy. It was funny. I even thought it was funny. And it was because the British Parliament had voted no. Cameron wanted to send military help for the civil war in Syria because he thought we were about to do the same in Washington. And then they didn't, and then President Obama changed course, and so just like a real relationship, it's not what we're not aiming for or back to Mrs. Swift, you're not aiming for pure happiness or no conflict. It's just you want to be constructive in your disagreement. But long-winded way of saying it, is 1600 Pennsylvania so to speak, getting along with number 10 Downing? Like, yeah, mostly. And if they aren't, it's productive and interesting anyway. What I was much more seized with, and still am, is not whether we're getting along between our countries. Are we getting along within them? And that's what I am thinking about, eager to talk about with all of you, because I actually think the most important thing to world affairs and this wonderful World Affairs Council is actually domestic diplomacy.
So tell us more.
Well, I mean, we are talking at each other, we are talking past each other, or we're not talking at all. We are, and I am guilty of all of this, we are all participants in this indignation machine. And we just get all riled up. And it is, sort of in obvious ways corrosive to our community. I think it is deeply corrosive inside each and every one of us. It's like, and I don't know enough about chemical engineering, but it's like, running your combustion engine on the wrong kind of stuff. Like it just corrodes it. And it's not good. And the way I've been reflecting on it, and I haven't fleshed this out yet, I'd love to know your thoughts. And I don't want to get party political at all, because this is not left or right or Democrat. We've lost sight, I think, of the best part of our country. And it was there at the beginning with all the hypocrisy that is at the beginning of our founding, and the great stuff too, which is if I played a little game, 2 cars in a parking lot here. You have to guess who's the Democrat car and which is the Republican car. Okay, and I'm not going to make it easy. It's not a blue Prius and a red Ford F-150 pickup. They are identical bland white cars, okay, or gray cars, and they each have 1 bumper sticker only and 1 word on that bumper sticker. Car number 1 says freedom. Car number 2 says together. We would get 100. We get that test right every single time. So I'm about to turn 52. My entire life, I have watched that word freedom be taken to a sort of extreme of freedom from one another. Just leave me or leave us alone. I have seen together in a similar way taken to an extreme where one major candidate in my party had a bumper sticker that said, "Not me, us. Give up your individualism for the community." I think, in answer to I think what we really want and what we desperately need is freedom together. And not some wishy-washy combination. Not freedom from one another, but freedom through and with one another. And the following I'm about to say, which will never happen, but we celebrate July 4th. You could all give me good stories about your favorite July 4th you've ever celebrated, right? No one can tell me, I doubt it, your favorite September 17th, which is National Interdependence Day. We don't call it that, but it is the Constitution, National Citizens and Constitution Day. We don't celebrate it because it's sort of boring and civicsy. I think we should, because any band of revolutionaries can declare independence. Look, and you guys are very smart about global affairs. In any given year, a whole bunch of people do that. That was not what was amazing about Philadelphia. Being free from King George feels good for like 5 minutes. Now what are we going to do? How can we be free together? They could have just been separate colonies, free. They decided, and again, with all the hypocrisy and imperfection enshrined in the Constitution, they wrote a Constitution to try to figure out how we could be free together. And that, I think, we have lost. So that's sort of the look back, and then if you take it to the current day, you can picture whatever topic comes to your mind to keep this party neutral. There are a bunch of issues for which a bunch of fired up people want to end something. Now, on a certain of those things, personally, I am with them. once those people show up, another group shows up. And the people who want to defend that thing those other people want to end. You could end policing. You could end a woman's right to choose or reproductive health. You could end, so I mean, it's not a political judgment. I want to end it. A bunch of people want to defend it. What I think is required, and I understand and I see why that has, there is another set of people and activities and energy, which is people who want to mend it. Who want to mend and amend the rules of a game that they love. And I think we do that in sports, or we could do that in sports because that isn't highly politicized. If you call it civics, it gets boring, everyone leaves the room, except for a certain sort of Model UN type. But I mean, we don't need just the Model UN types, right? We don't need the folks who line up 4 deep at Kentucky Author Forum, like who wants to ask this person a question at the end. That's a tiny percentage of us who want to go stand up in front of a whole bunch of strangers and ask some question. This mending work is really, really important, and it's the only way democracy works. And it doesn't mean people can be fired up about ending things, people can be fired up about defending things. Certainly, I'm glad in history that people have done both those things. I just think we have neglected the habits and manners and patterns and tone of mending. And that's what I want to do more of.
So, this series is about the word in transition. And you've already alluded to a lot of things that are happening in the world in terms of nationalism, protectionism. It's been a shift that's been happening not only here in the United States, but I think it's happening in the UK and other parts of the world, where you've talked about the global war on terrorism. There's also a global war going on for talent right now. There's probably a war that's going on the idea of globalization. Why are we, feeling this right now? Why is the world really in transition?
Well, it's interesting, Omar. It's an amazing show. Have anyone watched? I think it's HBO. It's the guy who wrote The Wire. Did this new police thing called We Own This City, about police corruption in Baltimore. Anyway, I highly recommend it. It's a little strange, it's hard to watch, but it's brilliantly done. And at the second to last episode, it's like 8 episodes, second to last episode, it's all based on a real story. You meet this man, you haven't seen him yet, and he's 75-year-old guy who's a former cop who is now teaching in public school. And they're asking him for sort of his reflections on this, what's gone on in his beloved city. And he said, you know what? I'm oversimplifying, but it just all began when we declared a war on drugs, because once you've said the word war, you've just committed yourself to a mindset where we are at war with our own citizens. And then you're arming yourselves against your own people. Like everything that followed is just from that word war. And so back to winning and losing, it's like we have a lot of hard work to do. I don't think it's a war. And so I was down at Fort Knox talking to the Army. The U.S. Army is struggling to recruit, right? They miss very publicly, and they're working on it. 25% short of the goal on recruiting. And they're like, so we're launching a war on talent. I'm just like, there are other frameworks for how to think about the hard work and the language and body language we need to attract talent. I don't think war is the helpful one, even a little bit. You see what trade wars do. I mean, like there was a giant with the European Union, which I know we, talk about. Like, look, we have disagreements with China that are real and deep and complicated and all that stuff. It's like, what are we fighting about? Steel and American whiskey with the Europeans? Like, so war gets you that tit for tat, and there's a time and place for it, but not, I think, in so many contexts.
All right. Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions now. I've got a zillion other questions, but I see a lot of you. Oh, so many good hands. We'll start with you.
Okay. Thank you for being here. I know with a relatively short notice, we do appreciate your presence. I was in England when the Queen died, and I experienced a lot of the issues you read. I would love if you can expand about the domestic issues in England that really, in a sense, parallel us, but you probably know more about them than I observed in a week or 10 days. Because I felt them talking to people, immigrants, British, and I could sense there is a lot of, and some people are dreaming that not this king is his son. When he becomes king, it will be perfect. That's what I heard.
I know. I mean, that is certainly a widely, I don't know if everyone heard that, but there's sort of the like, I'm a huge King Charles fan. I'll just come out as one. I think he will, look, if you go back to the Jack Daniels bottle, he clearly, if he's the Jack Daniels bottle, he sort of got out in front of, so he's probably got some, realigning to do, but okay. I think he knows that. I think his speeches signaled that that's what he would go do. And he will, just like his mother, be in this rolling renegotiation also, because, in terms of what the UK is struggling with, yes, I mean, the big issues when I was there, again, was not does DC and London officialdom like each other, get along. It was, Scotland first, and then what became Brexit. And in the Scottish one, I remember, that was 2014. So like within the first year I got there, and people would say, this, from both sides of it, would be like, we're just going to do this because it'll settle it for a generation. And I thought to myself, but I was enough of a diplomat, I didn't say it. I was like, I bet it'll settle it for a generation of fruit flies. Like, and this is what's weird about life. Like, we all know this. Like, things don't, it's back to winning and losing, and it's back to war. It's like, we love this like false finality. It's like, oh, we did it. But think about the good things in life. Think about like if you've been publicly recognized, which doesn't happen, or just for something, it really feels good for like 5 minutes, maybe 5 days. It just sort of dissipates, and then you find joy from things that aren't winning. And the struggle gives much more meaning to stuff. So they thought we could just get this done once and for all. Nope, it doesn't work that way. I remember on the UK thing, I was at some fancy thing that I got invited to lots of fancy things, and I was sitting next to some guy I didn't know. He told me, without me having to ask, that he had just written a 500,000 British pound check, this is before Brexit, to the Remain. Okay, good to know. And so we're in this in Mansion House, this amazing place in the city of London, and there's a flag that I don't recognize, the flag of England, and then the Union Jack. And I just said to him, I said, oh. I was like, can you imagine a fourth flag one day being there that's the European Union flag? And I mean, I felt like he was going to pick up his butter knife and like stab me. He was like, over my dead body. Never. He had written a 500,000 pound check to stay in to a flag he hated. He did it for like very pragmatic, I mean, all like, I don't think it's stupid to leave because, but no heart. And I thought to myself, uh-oh.
This is a two-pronged question, really, if you don't mind, but I think you're well qualified to answer both.
You will be the judge.
Not difficult to do, but but there's lots of research that says the biggest influencer from America to the world is Hollywood, more than any other thing. Whatever Hollywood says about America, whether it's guns or police or anything else, is what leaves a lasting impression in markets overseas. That being the case, if that research is right, and it seems to be, at least in my experience, having worked around the globe, then why is Hollywood completely ignored on this issue? No real thinkers are talking about it. No real journalists are writing about it. The second question is also, I think you're very qualified for, is what do you see is the difference between being an appointed ambassador where you come from the outside world rather than a career diplomat from the inside?
Yeah. I'll do the first one first, second one second. Thank you. On the Hollywood side, so I didn't remember, with these kids, young people, which is only a phrase that old people say, which is like me. So I didn't say, so I'd have them flip over the card and I'd say, now please write a word or draw a picture of something that inspires you or gives you hope about the United States and what we're up to. So I have that, is that my phone going on? I think it is. I apologize. That's embarrassing. I muted it, but I guess alarms override the mute. Okay. Okay, so there wasn't one giant one on the positive side, like there was guns on the negative side. But there were 5 sort of tied for first place. And let's run this through your Hollywood hypothesis, because I think it overlaps, but I don't think it completely explains it. Opportunity, freedom, diversity, food, sports. You know, and if we go back to the negative side of the card, number 4 was healthcare. I don't think there's lots of Hollywood stuff about inequitable healthcare access in our country or inequitable healthcare outcomes in our country. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are some, but like that's not the majority of what guns for sure, racism, I suppose, in some ways, police brutality, some films, but that's not. So these young people are tuning into something that isn't just Hollywood in this sort of, because sometimes when you say Hollywood, it's kind of a loaded term. It's sort of code for like cheesy, blockbustery, profit motive stuff. If you brought it to like, you know, creative output of the United States, defined streaming, television, books, writing, and don't call it Hollywood, then I'd say, yeah, that's a huge, we read each other's books, we see each other's movies. I think that's a huge, and you've experienced it personally. Yeah, but it kind of goes back to my hunch, because I haven't thought it through yet, that you should only, so let's take some politically tricky topics. By the way, if you go into the UK and you sit with a bunch of concerned citizens, it's contagious. Concerned citizens like this group tonight, and you were to do the sort of like, what troubles you in your country? And I don't mean this disrespectfully, although it might come off that way. I remember when I first heard it, one of the top things people would write is knife crime. Knife crime is a scourge in the United Kingdom. And as an American, you're just like, what we wouldn't give to be grappling with knife crime. They are deadly. They don't find it like amusing or interesting, because I've tried. You know, it's like, oh, that's what they're really concerned about. People stabbing each other. It's Hollywood. You got to take the call. You got to take the call. So that's like that's just like a, you know, that's just a thing. I mean, they really, so we are so similar in so many different ways with these countries. If you look at those Economist magazine lists of GDP per capita, all that kind of stuff, except for, you know, gun ownership in America, like we are the top in the world, you know, in the top 5, and they are like the absolute bottom of that list. And it's not, and I say this as, you know, and I would try to explain it to these kids want to talk about guns. Like, what do I know? You know, I grew up in Massachusetts. I didn't know anyone who had a gun. I live in Kentucky. I know lots of people who have a gun. I have a gun, more than one. You know, and it's like, oh, and I was like, I'm not, and you could just see them look at me. I was like, look, they're shotguns for like shooting and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I do. 100 million Americans have guns. 30,000 people die every year from gun violence. 20,000 of them are suicides. That's 20,000 too many. 10,000 are homicides. That's 10,000 too many. But
Learn to turn off.
Turn the phone off.
but if you look at it proportion, so you're just like, okay, so look at that percentage. So 100 million homes. So if you treat, this is a political comment, if you treat 100 million people like they are the 10,000 people who shot someone with a gun, that is terrible math and idiotic politics. So I think if you're going to have really interesting reform of something important, like what can we do about way too many homicides, way too many suicides by guns, you should have people who love guns lead that. If we're going to reform NCAA athletics, you should have people who love college sports and don't like the exploitation that goes on within them. But to have a bunch of people who hate college sports and think sports is idiotic, make rules about it? So everyone's sort of nodding, yeah, maybe. Think about, so what I would say over there, I was like, okay, can you imagine dedicating your whole life to mending and amending the rules of cricket, something we know not many of us know, I don't know anything about cricket, and then you were to reveal to someone, it's like, well, do you like cricket? And you're like, no, hate it, waste of time. But you spend your entire life working on the rules of cricket. Then I asked my friend who was running the BBC at the time, who came up through business journalism, and I said, what percent of business journalists like business? He's like, none. None. That's weird to me.
We have a written
Can we have a male-female rule that we alternate, pretty please?
Oh,
Well, go ahead now, and then
Okay.
we'll do that.
So that was not targeted at, it felt personal. But
we have a written constitution. England has an unwritten constitution. While you were there, or even outside of England, you were closer to it while you were there. And did you ever have thoughts about, well, if we only had this unwritten constitution here for this one issue or something like that?
Well, mostly it was the other way around because of have you all been following the Liz Truss quasi-quater? Okay, so there was like a sort of like, not nobody, but like a boutique-y kind of issue on, hey, the written constitution crowd, sort of good governance set over in the UK, being like, we really ought to do this. And I know you all followed this, but like how they elected Liz Truss is strange, to an American strange, to British people strange. And this is the important part. We, I think as Americans, are sort of inclined to be like, well, it's not how we would do it, but they have been doing it for like 1,000 years, right? You sort of put it in the Magna Carta. It's like, I don't know, it's old, it works for them, it's strange. Not this thing. This is 1998. Okay, so they used to pick them, majority, we all saw the movies about Thatcher or whatever, right? Like she gets kicked out because enough MPs put in letters that it triggers an election, they have the ballots, and like in comes John Major, out goes Margaret Thatcher. But then in 1998, in like a backroom deal that didn't get a lot of attention at the time, which we can all relate to, sort of state party versus federal party for the Tories, and Labour did the exact same thing, by the way. And they didn't think a big deal of it. They're like, well, okay, we'll give membership, access to this, but you let us keep the database of voters. That was like the trade. It's like, fine, no one cared. Until 6 weeks ago, when a tiny group of people, this is not only, and they're all donors, right? You can't be a member of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party without paying. So like our primary system is weird and it encourages extremism on both parties. This is just if you only let political contributors vote. We're paying. You have to pay money to be one. So I'm involved with this really neat startup in London called Tortoise. Started with my friend who used to run the BBC and edit the Times of London. And we're actually seeking, it's strange as an American, he, and Tortoise, which is British, is seeking judicial review of that election process because a whole bunch of Tory donors. I mean, it's a tiny fraction. It's like 0.03% of the British public picked Liz Truss. Now, it's one thing if you let, the old way was MPs do it, they all got elected. So you can make the Republican argument, you know, the Republic, like, hey, they're elected representatives, they did something. Fine, you might not like it, but this thing is ludicrous. And Labor does it too. And so this has really increased, people being like, wait a minute, we either have to go back to the old one or we got to write some of this stuff down. But it's not a constitution, that, you know, it's a private thing. It's a club that picked it. It's a club, yeah. And they happen in that party to be mostly old and mostly boys.
Gentile?
Earlier you were talking about how the United States that we're having domestic abuse basically occurring within our group. I was wondering, as somebody who's Burundian, who was born and raised around there, and then came to America, I'm an American citizen now. How do we have conversations like this without feeling like other? Because I feel like when we're here, we can participate in the conversations without Americans viewing you automatically as like, you know, an other person. Like, you don't understand that at the end of the day, I am an American and I have an American citizenship. So like moving forward, how do you fix that, or how do you have conversations about that to fix that?
That is the question. So I'll give you a unsatisfying answer, but so when I got back to Kentucky, I really missed these school visits. So I was just like, I'm not going to stop doing them. It's slightly weird because I had no reason to keep doing them. But people in Louisville and Southern Indiana are nice. So they would like let me show up in their high school and like do the same exercise. So I didn't do it 20,000 kids, but I go to like Fern Creek High School. I went to Southern Indiana. I went to public schools, Catholic schools, you know, sort of the mix. So like, and I did the same thing. I didn't ask them about the UK because I know no one's thinking. I mean, you know, we don't really. I mean, this crowd does, but like, I'm not going to ask you much. But I did it just on ourselves. To your question, so I said, what is your number one? What frustrates, confuses, or concerns you about the United States? Draw me a picture. Let's talk about it. Flip it over. What inspires you, gives you hope about the United States? Okay, so here's what I learned. Number one fear, division.
What?
Division, followed by loneliness. Number one hope, diversity followed by freedom. Let's take the two number ones and compare them. Division and diversity. Both have the same root, div. So what they fear most and want most is somehow connected to separateness. Which is, as you heard in the lovely introduction, it's like what they really are saying is, how do I stand out and fit in? And so that's what I ended up writing this book about, inspired by these young people. I was like, okay. Now, it turns out we have a great symbol in our complicated past that perfectly symbolizes how you can stand out as your own person and fit into something greater than yourself. It's on the back of a US dollar bill. It's on your, do you have an American passport? No? Okay, so it's on the front of your American passport. We just look through it, we don't notice it. I've looked at it 1,000 times before I wrote my book, because I put it. So there's the eagle, and there's the olive branches, and the arrows, and you know our, now I'm going to quiz you like an annoying grown-up, but our national motto, very close, that's Kentucky, e pluribus unum, no, but that's even better, extra credit, Kentucky. It's e pluribus unum, so from many one. Right. Okay. That's on the front of the logo. They figured that out right away. They wanted that logo. They wanted that motto. They haggled. It took them longer to design this logo. This is Jefferson, Adams, and Franklin. Were put on. They wrote the Declaration of Independence. Their next job was to design the logo. Took them longer to design the logo than to win the war. They haggle about it. They fight about it. 3 failed committees. Blah blah blah. They finally pick it. And the last piece, the back, they got to pretty soon, which is the unfinished pyramid with the seeing eye thing. And then the front was the eagle that I mentioned, and shield and the arrows and everything. And then the final thing above the motto was the radiant constellation, right? And that was supposed to represent how you could be separate, your own star, and fit into something more powerful, a constellation. And they picked it because it was 13 of them, so 13 states, proudly Massachusetts, where I'm from, still Massachusetts, but part of this larger thing. The United States, newly formed, part of this other countries in the world. And that was this image. And George Washington gets elected as the first president, and he gets to name 5 Navy ships. And he's not fanciful. He doesn't go ancient Greece and Rome. He doesn't do place name. The USS United States, the USS Congress, the USS President, the USS Constitution, and the USS Constellation. It was practical, it was tactical, and that, I think, is an incomplete answer to your question, which is we need to remember the way of thinking, feeling, seeing, and behaving of what it's like to be a constellation, which is I'm a star, you're a star, you're a star, you're a star. We can choose to form connections between us to accomplish something bigger than we could alone. And I don't remember what it was like when you were little, but when someone teaches you the constellations, you know, like you can't unsee Orion's belt, which is a subset of a constellation. There are no lines between those stars, but you see them because someone showed them to you and you can't unsee them. And by the way, the next generation of folks aren't going to see Orion's belt and call it that if you don't tell them and show them that. Oh, and by the way, in other cultures, they don't call it that. And they reconfigure the same stars in totally different ones, and that's fine too. So I am hopeful that that symbol at the beginning, again, with all the hypocrisy at the beginning of the founding of our country, this idea of being free together, symbolized by the constellation, I think is what should guide our pattern and our tone we take with each other.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll come to you in a minute, but I'm going to stick to his male-female. Anyone from that side of the room? Well, you're a female. I'll come back to you. Any males? Males? No? But now we're, okay, we'll go with...
Matthew, I want to talk specifically about Brexit, which is one of the greatest ideas ever. And your view on it, if there's a positive, and you know.
Yeah, we were...
let's say, foreseen and unseen consequences.
Yeah, I mean, Rob, so Brexit was the question. I mean, at the time, President Obama, I think, but I would think this because I'm a big fan of his, I think he did it really well. He got a lot of heat in the UK for coming over April of 2016, 2 months before the referendum, and saying what he said, which was, I think, a very diplomatic, tasteful way of saying, look, of course it's up to you. Everyone keeps asking, so I'll share as a friend what it's like from my point of view. I think you guys are great together. And what I would say to my team, and they were just terrified I would ever say it to the press, but I did, which is it's a little bit like your great couple friends and their marriage, right? Like let's say they're having a problem and one of them comes to you and is like, we're thinking of getting divorced. It is hard, you have a swirl of emotions. We've all been through this, I'm sure. And part of it is just sort of selfish. It's like, oh, you guys are so fun to go out with. And I will never know what it's like to be in your marriage, and you'll never know what it's like to be in my marriage. And so there's just this humility, like, I don't know what it's like to be part of the European Union, and nor do any of us who are Americans. Like, we don't know. From where we sit, you guys do great work together because Europe can be kind of European-y and annoying, and the UK can be the sort of bridge because they're kind of more like us than them. And I did this unfair test. We'd have all these American official visitors come through, and I would sort of like, they're jet lagged or whatever, and I'd be like, what's it like to be in Europe or something? They're like, no, I don't go there till tomorrow. They all do it. Because it's like they felt like they were in they're overseas, but they're not in Europe yet. And that is true. And so this is impractical, but what I wish they had done, which could have been practical, is given people a multiple choice test on the referendum. One, be all in like Germany and France. I don't know what 2 would be. 3 would be sort of like, well, you're in, but you have your own currency and you have your own borders. Ding, ding, ding. That's what they were. And then 5 is like totally out. And you can imagine what the middle ones would be. And if you had 5 choices, my sense is people would have ended up around 3. Like we're of it, but we're not totally in it. And that's fine. In a constellation mindset, that's fine. Spaces between things are healthy. You don't want everyone brutally in line. Picture a pyramid, right? You either fit in or you are left out. I think the European Union at its work acts like a pyramid, you know, like top down, fit in or get out. And that's awful. And they shouldn't behave that way, and they deserve what they get for acting that way. I don't think that's all they are, but that is a very repellent pattern and tone that the EU sadly takes way too often, and they don't need to. I think their flag is really interesting. It's all those stars like perfectly in a circle. You know, I like our constellation, which, by the way, the original one is like asymmetrical, big stars, little stars, they're not spaced evenly. That's kind of America, and I think if the European Union had approached it more like us, by the way, like, we are not a hierarchy, right? The United States, I mean, we are hierarchical in our institutions sometimes, but like Kentucky does not report to Washington, D.C. Louisville does not report to Frankfurt. Like, that's just not how, we're not set up like a corporation with an org chart. We're set up like a constellation. Like, we have these connections, we have, and so if they had behaved more like that, I think it didn't have to go the way it goes.
Business over there, it's been just all about 10,000 the jobs moved from UK to Europe.
Yeah.
Because now, without them being part of the European Union, it made no sense to be someplace where they're not.
Yeah.
And borders, it used to be, you sit through, you got, 3-day waits for, trucks to.
Yeah, it's a self-inflicted, and we tried, and then so I think if President Obama hadn't said anything, we would second, or it would be like, well, you should have said something, because it was close enough that you sort of, so it's too bad.
Over here.
Yeah, up front and then in the back.
I would love to go back again to the topic of young people, because I think that as we talk about a world in transition, we're not just talking about geopolitics, we're talking about also generational transition.
Yeah.
And I'm so lucky to work with a lot of young people who really want to make change, and they believe they can and they will. And as you're talking about mending, and how do we mend in terms of our domestic policy and the issues that young people seem to care about universally, not just here, not just in the UK, but to a great extent globally, what advice would you have based on the experience that you've had in the UK and now here, and the fact that you are a father? What advice would you have in talking with these young people to really help them realize they're leaders of today, they're leaders of tomorrow, but to help them realize what the right path might be to help mend the country, and therefore beyond that?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so my daughter, we have boy-girl twins and then a little son, and the twins just turned 21, so that's a thing, Sharon, can you believe it? I mean, it's crazy. So they turned 20, so I was with one of my daughter's friends before that, and I don't know what made me think to ask it, but I said, I sort of knew what the answer would be. I said, have you ever sent an email to a friend? She's like, of course not. And then she paused, she goes, have you? And I was like, I have sent more emails to friends than I can possibly count. And this is just an interesting generational disconnect. That is like if I asked all of you, have you ever sent an intra-office memo in a manila thing to a friend? You'd be like, no. No, that's so weird. That's not what you do to friends, right? But I associate, so Emails are things that principals send to students. It's rarely good news. It is a one-way. One friend a couple years earlier said they didn't know you could send them back. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's just pure one-way, authoritarian, bad news fest. Why would I ever do that to a friend? So there's just sort of that awareness of like, oh, okay, like there are these great generation differences even that you could look over. I read this great book, and I can't remember his name. It'll come to me. It won't come to me tonight, but it'll come to me sometime when I can look it up. He's I don't know what we call them now, but when I grew up, you had home ec and shop. Is that, you know? Okay, so shop was like woodworking and metalworking. Okay, so he was a shop teacher in Western Massachusetts, and he wrote this really skinny, awesome book. And in it, he tells the story of how he graded his students. And he used to do it the old way, like they'd bring up their welds, and he'd be like, A, B, whatever. Then he did something much more cool that I think is exciting and I think gets at your question, which is he just had a big bin of what he deemed A welds and B welds and C welds and D welds and then failing welds. And they'd come up and he'd look at it and he'd say, there you go. Come back to me and tell me what bucket you think it belongs in. And he's like, it's amazing. Like, he's like, I don't know, 5% are too generous on themselves, 5% are too harsh. But like mostly everybody puts a B weld in the B weld thing. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think, and I want to like corporate America, or let's not even corporate, like institutional America, anyone who does annual performance reviews, which are by and large, someone once said that there's no such thing, I'm not going to say the two part of it, no such thing as bad pizza. You heard that? That like pizza is inherently a good combination of ingredients. You could have a mediocre pizza, a good pizza, or a great pizza. But the ingredients are such that you can't really have a terrible one. Let's just say that's true. I think annual performance reviews are the exact opposite. I don't think you can ever have a great one. I just think they're kind of like, at best, mediocre and awkward, and at worst, soul-destroying for both people involved, if it's like that. And so, as I think about this next generation, it would be neat if they could think about their work, which is probably not what it's like at school necessarily, but like in grown-up life, that they are building up a portfolio of welds and of work. That when they are being evaluated, they are looking at other people's work and looking at their work, and something really interesting happens with the body language. Picture an annual performance review in a company or at Metro government or wherever we might be. The two people are shoulder to shoulder, like looking at something else. Not looking at you or looking at me and like judging the person. Like you know what I mean? It's the work. And if we can shift more things about the work, I think we get, that ties back to domestic diplomacy, and it just makes it less bad. And by the way, there's a great lesson from, we're Louisville, so we have how many people have flown Southwest Airlines? Okay, so United Airlines? Okay, so I was with this guy who is like a highly compensated coach, executive CEO coach type. And he works with Southwest Airlines. And so I learned this about him, and I'm very excited because I commuted up to Chicago for the Obama campaign on Southwest. I love Southwest. They win best airline in America, and I hate United Airlines. I just hate, and remember they dragged that guy, they beat up that guy trying to come to Louisville? I mean, it's awful, and I think they deserve the bad press they got. And I said, can you tell me their secret? Because I think there's something we as diplomats could learn from Southwest Airlines. He goes, it's not a secret, it's super simple. Do you want me to tell you? Yes, please. Here are the two things. He said, okay, you're in Chicago, it's midway, huge snowstorm, everyone's flight's canceled. American, United, Southwest Airlines. You come up to United Airlines and you say, you've just canceled my flight to Louisville. And I'm trained to tell you, I'm so sorry, ma'am, there's been a snowstorm, we have no flights for you, we're working on it. I called you, ma'am, I looked you in the eye and I told you the truth, check, check, check. Southwest Airlines is trained to say, you say you've just canceled my flight. We've got to get you home. Here's our challenge. Louisville canceled, Indy canceled, Lexington canceled. And he said, did you see the difference? And I said, I felt it. The second one was better. He said, there are two things we train our people to do. The first one's very easy, which is just make you feel like I'm on your side. We got to get you home. He said, but the second thing is much more important and much harder for all of us. In the fancy lingo I learned is externalizing the constraints. Notice United Airlines, so the bad news is on this piece of paper. You and I are shoulder to shoulder looking at the bad news. What are we going to do? What we all do, we don't act like Southwest Airlines. We all act like United Airlines. And we internalize the bad news. The United Airlines person says, we have no flights for you. So I have embodied the snowstorm, and I am standing between you and seeing the people you love in Louisville. It's not my fault that there's a snowstorm and everyone's, but this is what we all do. We do it in political discourse, we do it in corporate discourse. We embody all this bad news that we didn't create. And it makes us defensive, and it makes our body language weird, and it's just bad. And so this little trick of like, hey. So I think with the young people, if we can get into that welding and make it about the work, and not about pointing fingers and being like, you Gen Z people don't value the stuff I value. Like, I don't know where that gets you. Talk about the work.
So Matthew and I want to hear you, but unfortunately, we only have one time for one more question. So in the back.
So the question I was really hoping I got to ask you was, I'm married to a British man, so he has lots of feelings. And I have
Where's he from?
Okay, he's from Liverpool. So my question for you, especially
Is he Everton or Louisville Football Club fan?
we're not touching that one.
Uh-oh.
So the question I have for you, especially with you, being in the UK right before you might pass away, is what do you see from what you've heard from both sides, both on the US side and the UK side? What do you think the future of the monarchy is? Do you think there is a future of the monarchy, or do you think that it is going to slowly erode and unravel?
Sort of how's the monarchy going to go now that the Queen died? I don't know. I suspect, back to the Jack Daniels, it is always changing, and it has been, and her brilliance was making it look just like the good people at Jack Daniels, like it never changes. So I think King Charles, if he's able to realign with where people are and move with them, that it'll keep going there. And when he hands it off to William, I think he is very well prepared to do the same, and it'll keep moving, so it won't be the same old one. And if it were, we wouldn't stand for it. And I think back to the Queen for a moment, one of her many gifts was she didn't say, oh, well, she didn't cling to the empire, nor did she be like, oh, I guess it's just pure independence. She really, and people make fun of it, but I don't think they should, she held on to this idea of the Commonwealth, which also has to change and is imperfect, but it is kind of like a constellation, a voluntary constellation of countries. That has to change and evolve. But I think she was very alive to the interdependence. So is King Charles, just different. It expresses itself more in harmony and nature and the planet and climate, where he got kind of out in front relative to where other people wanted him to be. But I think there's a similarity in their recognition of, and being in a constitutional monarchy, you have to be pretty aware that you're just, a bunch of consecutive bad moods and it's all over, right? They're aware of that.
But then there's an obsession with royalty. Why is that worldwide?
Well, someone made this point, which cool, and I got to see this, two thoughts, just maybe a strange way to close it, but I remember being at one sort of unremarkable Wednesday night at our place. We're throwing some event for something, and it's which we did, 6 nights a week, so it wasn't. And someone came in and said, "Oh, you Americans are so good at you're so look at your diversity." And I looked around the group, and it was all basically white Brits over 55. And so I was sort of feeling This is like hard, and we did lots of wonderfully diverse events. This just wasn't one of them. And so, with my eyes, so I said that, I was like, oh, this isn't diversity. But she was seeing class diversity that we just don't see as Americans. So I just see a bunch of like highly accomplished people, whatever that function was. And she sees from Liverpool, from Newcastle, from Leicester. They saw diversity that I couldn't see. But that's not how I wanted to end it on that strange point. Help me. Not monarchy.
The obsession with royalty.
Oh, obsession with, thank you. Obsession with royalty. So one of the things I observed was, like, and this is real, that they take all of their, like if you read an old Jane Austen book, like Pride and Prejudice, or if you watch the movie like I did, I also read the book. And it's like they'll have some big party and it's like, oh my God, the Duke and Duchess of blah, blah, blah came and everyone's a flutter. And if you meet the current Duke and Duchesses of anything, like the room is not a flutter, like, oh, who cares? And especially as Americans, you're like, whatever, right? And so a great British friend said, that's not the test. If like George Clooney and Amal came to a party, would you be a flutter? And I'd be like, yeah, I think that'd be pretty cool. So basically the royal family, and really the Queen while she was alive, just takes up all the sort of celebrity energy of that country. They put it all on her or those small group. So like Mick Jagger's at the table, David Cameron, Prime Minister, like nobody cares when they walk. It's really amazing. Like in America, everyone's bothering them, taking pictures of them and everything. Like in London, they're no big deal. And there's something sort of healthy about that because it kind of has this nice egalitarian thing. Maybe overdo it with the royal family, but they underdo it for everyone else, which I think is healthy. And it's what's tricky about the office of the president for us as Americans, because it's head of state and head of government. You know, and if the Speaker of the House of Representatives is in the room, whoever she or he might be, I think grossly, or people aren't like, oh my God. If the president of the it's just like, whoa. Like everyone sort of sits, whether you like that person or don't, they're your political party or they aren't. We put on to that building and to that office a lot of stuff. You know, that's our head of state, and we put those royal style expectations on that family, how we talk about the whole family, all of that, which is, you know, so that's how I think about it.
Thank you. You had asked a question about being a career diplomat versus being an appointed diplomat.
That's a better one to
I'm going to try to answer that, and then you can add to it. One of the things that I love about Matthew, and we're so grateful to have you here, is that, you know, his down-to-earth personality and things of that nature. A lot of times the government officials very much focus on being the kings and queens of their seat, and as you can see, someone like you that has been in high positions as an ambassador, he's still down to earth, and we really appreciate that. Thank you, Matthew.
That's very sweet of you.
Thank you.
We'll end on that.